Senator, thanks for coming in the studio. It's good to see you.
Good to be with you.
What do you want to accomplish in a third term you haven't already accomplished in the last 12 years? Why are you running again?
Look, there's an enormous amount we need to do. Texas right now, Texas is booming. Texas, what we're doing is we're doing it right. Texas is the best place on the planet for jobs. You know, I just came from a big press conference in Midlothian where Google announced they're investing an additional $1 billion in the state of Texas. Massive new construction. We're talking about thousands of new jobs. My number one priority in the Senate is jobs, jobs, jobs. And why is it that companies from all over America come to Texas to open jobs? Because we're the best environment. We have low taxes, reasonable regulations, and we got to protect, we got to keep Texas, Texas. And my priorities in the Senate are jobs, freedom, and security, protecting our families, fighting for 30 million Texans. Jason, I jump out of bed every day having the chance to do that.
Senator, I covered you in 2012 when you wanted to go to D.C. and break up the status quo. After 12 years, do you think you are part of the status quo now in D.C.?
Look, I am a leader in Texas and in D.C., and I'm proud of that. But my job is to fight for 30 million Texans. And so whether it means standing up to terrible policies that hurt Texans, and that's been true whether that came from Barack Obama or Chuck Schumer or Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, or whether it has been working to bring together bipartisan coalitions to accomplish big victories for the people of Texas. You know, I'm the ranking member on the Senate Committee of Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over about 40% of the U.S. economy. And it is incredibly impactful for the state of Texas. Next year, if Republicans take the majority, I'll be the chairman of the Commerce Committee. That is a huge deal if you care about jobs in the state of Texas. And over 12 years in the Senate, I've built a record of delivering real results. I've authored and passed 100 different pieces of legislation that have been signed into law that are making a difference for thousands and thousands of new jobs in Texas, and that's a fight I'm proud to do.
Let's talk about your opponent. How would you tell Texans, the independents out there, and there are some, they usually lean a little more conservative in this state, but there are independents out there.
Sure.
How would you tell them that you are different from Colin Allred?
Well, listen, I think elections should be about your record and results, and there is a dramatic difference between me and Congressman Allred. Congressman Allred's record has been hard left. His first 4 years in the House, he voted 100% with Nancy Pelosi. He literally did not deviate on a single issue. Listen,
but he's constantly ranked as one of the most bipartisan members of Congress.
Well, he gets left-wing groups to say that, but it's an empty boast. His voting record was identical to Nancy Pelosi. I don't think there's a Texan on the planet who thinks Nancy Pelosi is bipartisan. I'll tell you, Colin Allred has been a knee-jerk vote. He's voted repeatedly in favor of open borders. He voted against deporting illegal aliens who violently assault police officers. Listen, that's a nutty position. He's voted repeatedly against jobs and oil and gas in the state of Texas. He voted with Joe Biden in favor of Joe Biden's halting the export of liquid natural gas. He has been a hard left vote, but it's interesting. He combines being a hard left vote with getting nothing done. He's been in the House of Representatives for the last 6 years. He's authored and passed three bills into law. He's essentially done nothing in his time in Congress. In the same time, in 12 years, I've authored and passed 100 different pieces of legislation, almost all with major bipartisan support. And so what he calls bipartisan is he takes a Democrat bill that is passing, that has a few Republicans on it, and he votes with the Democrats. He follows Nancy Pelosi's orders and he votes with her. And he says, look how bipartisan I am. I'm voting for a Democrat bill that has a few Republicans. That's not actually doing the job. Let me give you an example. Legislation that I authored and passed last year, December of last year, deals with bridges from Texas to Mexico. There are 4 new bridges that are being built from Texas to Mexico. 2 in Laredo, 1 in Brownsville, 1 in Eagle Pass. All 4 of them were being delayed by bureaucratic regulations from the Biden administration. And the local leaders in South Texas came to me and they said, Ted, would you lead the fight to get this done? I said, I'm happy to. And I teamed up with Democrats. I authored legislation to expedite the permitting. We got that passed through the Senate, passed through the House, signed into law. And just a few months ago, those permits were finally granted. That accelerated those 4 bridges by 3, 4, 5 years, and the impact on the state of Texas just from that one bill is going to be tens of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of investment, billions of dollars of impact for Texans. And so that's a real bipartisan result. And you know what? I would be more than happy to compare my record to Colin Allred's, but you know what? You're about the only person in the state of Texas in the media that has actually interviewed Colin Allred. Today is the 51st day he's gone without having a press conference. He doesn't answer questions. He doesn't talk about his record. He doesn't talk about Kamala Harris. He's terrified to talk about Kamala Harris. And so, look, I think this election should be comparing our records and comparing our vision for Texas.
Well, speaking of comparing records, do you expect you two will be face-to-face in a debate before Texans?
Listen, I'm confident we will. I'm eager to do so. You and I were talking just a minute ago. I think that's a responsibility that elected officials and that candidates owe the voters, to have a debate, to answer hard questions. This is something I've done. You and I have had interviews, I don't know, dozens of interviews, I would guess by now. I think that's a real responsibility. Tomorrow I'm going to do a press conference. This will be, I think, my 7th press conference in 6 weeks. So I think it is a responsibility to stand up and answer hard questions. Colin Allred is actually employing the exact same strategy Kamala Harris is. Both of them have decided to follow the Joe Biden basement strategy, where they hide in the basement. They don't do media interviews. Kamala Harris has been the Democrat nominee, or the presumptive nominee, for 25 days. She hasn't done a single media interview. She reads from teleprompters and hides from answering questions. That's exactly what Colin Allred is doing. And they do it because they can't defend their record. Open border, massive inflations, out-of-control crime. That's not a record they want to defend.
Senator, let me ask you a hard question here. Abortion, that's a big issue for a lot of women in this state this November. Are there any exceptions that you would support for abortion?
Well, listen, what the Supreme Court said in the Dobbs decision is that abortion is an issue that people of good faith disagree on, and disagree real. There are people that are pro-life, people that are pro-choice, and the Supreme Court said the way we resolve questions like that under the Constitution is the voters at the ballot box. That's democracy. And so questions of what the rules in abortion are will be made by state officials in Austin, the state legislature, the governor. And the situation we have right now, every state makes different rules. You wouldn't expect Texas to have the same rules as California. And I think that respects the diversity in our country. Now, what's interesting is, and so my view is the rules will be made by the state legislature. What's interesting is contrast that with Colin Allred's views. His views on abortion are quite frankly extreme. He has voted for federal legislation to strike down every single limitation on abortion, legalizing abortion literally up until the moment of birth in the 8th and 9th month. Now, Jason, that's an extreme position. Nationally, about 9% of Americans agree with that. 91% of Americans say, look, that's too much. Even people who are pro-choice, a majority of pro-choice Americans say, listen, abortion in the 9th month, that should not be allowed. And yet Colin Allred has proudly voted to allow that. I think that's an extreme position.
But for clarity, for voters who are going to the ballot box and voting on this race, the largest one, what do you tell them if they want to know, where does Ted Cruz stand on this? You're not shy about telling people where you stand on an issue.
I'm not at all. Listen,
would you support any exceptions for rape or for incest, Senator?
So I have supported legislation that has exceptions for rape and incest, but the reality today is these issues are not being decided at the federal level. They're being decided at the state level. And so the candidate who has voted for federal legislation to strike down federal laws, or state laws rather, is Colin Allred. He's voted for legislation that would strike down the law in Texas and legalize abortion up to and including the 9th month in pregnancy. That's not where Texans are. And if you want to know what I believe in, you can look at legislation that I've introduced, and I've authored and introduced legislation to protect IVF, to protect in vitro fertilization. Now, one of the reasons I introduced that legislation is that Colin Allred and other Democrats are demagoguing. They're trying to scare people into believing that in vitro fertilization is in jeopardy. And so I introduced legislation to have a clear and unequivocal federal right to IVF. I'm a huge supporter of IVF. I think it's a medical miracle. I did it with Katie Britt, senator from Alabama. The two of us introduced it. We went to the Senate floor to try to pass it, and you know what happened? The Democrats very cynically stood up and objected. You know why? Because they want to campaign scaring people on IVF, rather than, if they'd not objected, our legislation would have passed and we would have a clear federal statute protecting IVF. That's what I'm fighting for.
How about a federal abortion ban? You introduced legislation, I think, years ago on that.
That's not true. That is absolutely not true. Colin Allred says it, but it's false.
Do you support it now?
There's not going to be, so listen, in the federal government, the way the Senate operates, there's what's called the filibuster. The filibuster requires 60 votes to pass major legislation. it means for anything to pass the Senate, you've got to have broad bipartisan agreement. What I have supported is restrictions on late-term abortions, on exactly what Colin Allred supports. 8th and 9th month late-term abortions, abortions after the unborn child can feel pain. And I got to tell you, it really is disturbing to see Colin Allred and the Democrats who vote against the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. You know what the Born Alive Infant Protection Act was? What it said is if in the course of an abortion a child is born, right, and the baby is alive, and the baby is outside the mother, and the baby is breathing and crying and living, that the doctor can't just let the baby die, that you've got to save the baby's life if the baby is alive and living. And Colin Allred and the rest of the Democrats, tragically in Washington, are against that. I think those are extreme positions. What I can tell you is there's a reason Colin Allred doesn't want to talk about that. There's a reason he wants to falsely say, and Kamala Harris does the same thing, that Republicans want a national abortion ban. Yeah. That's simply false, but they don't want to defend their own record. The only candidate here who has supported legislation to strike down federal laws at the extreme level is Colin Allred. That's his record, and he didn't want to talk about that.
Let's talk about abortion. Let's move on from abortion for a moment here, Senator. I want to ask you about the border. Trump told Elon Musk that he would execute the largest deportation in history if Trump is reelected. How do you think that would affect the Texas economy?
Listen, I can tell you right now the Texas economy is getting hammered by Kamala Harris and Colin Allred's open borders. What we've seen in the last 4 years is unprecedented. Joe Biden and Colin Allred and Kamala Harris made a decision to break our border. And understand, I worked hand in hand with Donald Trump to secure our border, and we had incredible success. At the end of the Trump administration, we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. That was incredibly good for the state of Texas. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris came into office, and they worked with Colin Allred to break the border. We have right now the worst illegal immigration in the history of our country. 11.5 million people have come in illegally to this country, and it is hurting the people of Texas.
But rates are going down right now. The number of illegal crossings are going down.
Okay, you're too smart to be conned by that. It's 11.5 million. What they've done is slightly tweaked it down so the invasion slowed a tiny bit right before the election. But let me tell you something. I spend a lot of time in South Texas. I spend a lot of time in the Rio Grande Valley. There is nobody in South Texas who defends this chaos, because when you see the human suffering, when you see the dead bodies of people who are dying, when you see, I've looked in the eyes of little girls and little boys who've been brutalized by human traffickers. I've looked in the eyes of women who've been sexually assaulted. It is inhumane, it is grotesque, it is wrong. And I gotta say, Colin Allred's record on the border is abysmal. He's repeatedly voted for open borders. He's repeatedly voted against securing the border. And I'll tell you what, I don't know what your views are, but if you're a Texan who believes we should build a wall and secure the border, you know what Colin Allred says? He says you're a racist. He repeatedly refers to the border wall as a racist wall, and in fact he has pledged in his own words that he will personally tear down the, quote, racist border wall. Those are extreme positions. That doesn't protect the people of Texas. The people of Texas want Texas to be safe and secure. They want to stop this massive illegal immigration that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and that Colin Allred want to have happen.
Let me get back to the exact question on that, though. If a large deportation of undocumented immigrants happens in this state, what will that do to the state economy? We saw a study not too long ago. They contribute almost $5 billion in taxes to the state here. What do you think will happen?
Listen, my view on immigration is simple. I've summed it up many times in 4 words. Legal, good. Illegal, bad. If you're suggesting that this illegal immigration is great for the economy of Texas, I'm sorry, Jason, you're just wrong. It is a massive cost. Go down to South Texas and ask them about their hospitals being overflowing, their schools being overflowing, their jails being overflowing. I'll tell you what, take a look, meet with the victims' families every single day. Americans are dying. We have Americans who are being murdered by illegal immigrants released by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We have children being brutalized by illegal immigrants released by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We have women being raped. And Colin Allred's position, he won't talk about it. Listen, I've sat down with the family of Jocelyn Nungary.
Sure.
Jocelyn was a beautiful 12-year-old girl in Houston, and she was kidnapped and raped and murdered by 2 illegal aliens that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris released. And they came from Venezuela, they came illegally, they were in federal custody. All Biden and Harris had to do was follow the law, put them on a plane and deport them. Right. And Jocelyn would still be alive. But instead, because they decided it was politically beneficial for them, they released them. They came to Houston and within a couple of weeks murdered that precious little girl. I've sat with Jocelyn's mom. I've sat with Jocelyn's grandfather. No parent should have to bury a child, but especially to lose your daughter in those circumstances, it is horrific. It is wrong. I've introduced legislation called the Justice for Jocelyn Act, designed to prevent this, and it would mandate the federal government, if you have an illegal alien in custody, you must keep that illegal alien in detention as long as there are detention beds. There were 3,000 open beds the day they released those murderers. When I released that legislation, I was joined in supporting that legislation by Kim Ogg, the elected Democrat district attorney in Houston. Right. Kim Ogg has served 2 terms, elected. She's a Democrat, been a lifelong Democrat. She's prosecuting the murderers who killed Jocelyn. And Kim, she's a Democrat. She's endorsed my reelection. I've got all over the state Democrats supporting my reelection. And Kim Ogg, the Houston DA, what she said is she wants a senator who will stand with law enforcement and stand up to secure the border. And Colin Allred's record has been terrible on that.
2 last questions for you, Senator. Will you accept the results of the November presidential election?
Of course, if they're fair and legitimate. Look,
do you think there's something at risk of this election not being fair and legitimate?
There's something at risk in every election. There's a reason we have laws, and we have laws concerning fraud, and we often have litigation after elections challenging the results and looking at, was it conducted fairly? I mean, we have an entire legal system, and so, of course, now what's interesting is that reporters almost never ask Democrats that. You know, Hillary Clinton, when Donald Trump won, Hillary Clinton said it was illegitimate and he was not the legitimate president. Stacey Abrams, remember she ran for governor of Georgia? She claimed Brian Kemp didn't win, he was illegitimate, and she was the governor of Georgia. That was just nutty. Look, I'm a big believer in democracy, but you know what's interesting? Today's Democrats have decided democracy doesn't matter. You look at earlier this year.
Come on, Senator. People seeing that will go back and immediately tell me, Jason, why didn't you ask the senator about January 6th?
Okay, but hold on. Let me finish the point I made. All right, you scoffed. Come on, Democrats don't think democracy doesn't matter. 3 states, Colorado, Illinois, and Maine, threw Donald Trump off the ballot. Because why? There's nothing that says defending democracy like saying the voters can't vote for my opponent. Look, that is disgraceful. And that is the position we see of Democrats. Look, you look at these prosecutions of Donald Trump. I think they're an absolute abuse of power. It is reasonable to like or dislike Donald Trump. Reasonable people can disagree. But you know what? In the United States of America, we have never once had a president or former president prosecuted, had the Department of Justice go after them. Under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, that's happened 4 different times. Banana republics do that. It's not what we do in America. I think it's an abuse of power, and frankly, I believe it is because they don't trust democracy. I think the reason why the Biden-Harris Justice Department is trying to go after Donald Trump with everything they have is they're terrified the voters are going to vote for him. And I'm a big believer it ought to be the voters who decide. It ought to be the voters in Texas who decide in Texas, and it ought to be the voters nationally who decide nationally.
Last question. How has Kamala Harris changed your campaign, if at all, in this state? She's clearly energized Democrats. Has that impacted you at all?
Well, listen, I think right now Kamala's on a bit of a sugar high. I know her well. I served in the Senate a lot of years with her. We were on the Judiciary Committee. Her record, she has been the single most left-wing senator in the entire U.S. Senate. You had one tracking organization that rated her to the left of Bernie Sanders and the left of Elizabeth Warren. I served with both Bernie and Elizabeth. That ain't easy. I think right now there's a bit of a sugar high. My hope is as we get into the election, people will focus on her record, and her record is frankly terrible. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris inherited peace and prosperity. We've now got rampant inflation that is hurting people. We've now got an assault on energy and oil and gas that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have led and that Colin Allred has supported. That's hurt Texas badly. We have chaos at our southern border. We have an assault on law enforcement. Look, Colin Allred repeatedly has supported defunding the police. That's crazy and it's damaging. And that record is terrible. And so I will say this. I think Kamala Harris becoming the nominee has been a really bad development for Colin Allred, because Kamala Harris was the border czar. That was her job for 4 years. They proudly announced she's in charge of the border, and yet she won't go to the border. In 4 years, as the border czar, she didn't go one time to the Rio Grande Valley. Colin Allred is not going down to the border, is not willing to see the human suffering it's caused. And there's a reason when he was on your show and you asked him about Colin Allred, or you asked him about Kamala Harris, and he kind of meekly endorsed her and then turned around and ran away. Look, it shows what the stakes are. If you support Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's open borders, if you support the policies of the last 4 years, those are policies that really hurt the people of Texas, and it's why Allred doesn't want to answer questions, because he can't explain his support for those extreme policies. I'm more than happy to explain my votes, my records, and the legislation that I've authored and passed into law that's making a real difference for jobs and for safety in the state of Texas.
Senator, thank you.
Thank you, Jason.